Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome SpaceCom, Space Congress Government Chair and NASA Strategy and Integration Manager, Susie Cunningham.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of SpaceCom, Space Congress 2023. It's so nice to see everyone in person this year, and Space Congress has really enjoyed partnering again with SpaceCom, something we plan to continue as we see great synergy in this combined conference. We had some great fireside chats, panels, and TINA talks yesterday, covering everything from space commercialization, climate change, and cybersecurity, to getting to the moon and long-term lunar human habitation, and also inspiring the next generation. We heard about the latest exciting aerospace activities, including space stations of the future and the latest spaceport initiatives. There are also some great exhibits to see. One of my favorites is Charlie, the robo-dog. We're continuing these themes today with some great presentations. That said, let me introduce Leah Martin from NASA's Office of Communications to kick off our fireside chat with Janet Petro, the Kennedy Space Center Director.
Well, good morning, Janet. Thanks for joining us today. It feels like a really great day to talk about Kennedy Space Center and the things that the center is doing to enable the future of space. So I'd actually like to kick it off. Last year was a really big year for the center. We saw the successful launch of Artemis 1, the test flight for the SLS system in Orion. You guys overcame some challenges that we saw leading up to launch, but I mean, I think the world was just completely engaged watching that test flight lift off. We saw the incredible imagery that came back, almost more than 1 million miles round trip for Orion on that test flight, a textbook splashdown. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what it was like leading the center through that historic time, and maybe answer the big question that I think everybody's asking, which is what's next for the center?
Well, thank you, Leah, for that question. I gotta start with saying it was. I'm incredibly honored to be here because I get to talk about the Kennedy Space Center and all the great accomplishments that we've had, and we have an incredible workforce, and I get to sit up here and brag about all the things that they got to do. But last year really was a banner year in the history of our center, the Kennedy Space Center. You know, it was our 60th anniversary. And back in 1962, when the center was established, it was all about the Apollo program and getting back to the moon, sending man there and recovering them safely back. So last year was really great capstone with the Artemis, the successful launch of the Artemis mission on November 16th. And I'll tell you, yes, it was incredibly challenging that entire year to walk through to get to that launch. I think everyone knows we went through 4 wet dress rehearsals and a tanking demonstration, and that wet dress rehearsal was to completely fill up the rocket with propellants, and then to go through the terminal countdown as a rehearsal prior to the actual event. And we had some leaks. We had to go figure out how to load the vehicle differently in a gentler, kindler way in order to not trip some things. We had to change some processes. Oh, and by the way, we had a couple hurricanes thrown at us. We had Nicole and Ian, and the first one made us roll back into the VAB, which is no simple task, to do all of the disconnects out at the pad and then reconnecting at the VAB and then rolling back out and doing all that work. And again, so much pride for the workforce that really engaged in that at the center. And it wasn't just the Kennedy and our contractor workforce, across NASA, our sister centers at Johnson and Marshall, their teams all worked hand in hand to make that happen. And then, drama to the end. We have these teams that are really trained, highly trained, ready to go out in the event that something's happened at the pad. And of course, on the night of November 16th, we had another leak on our mobile launcher, and the contingency crew, which is called the Red Crew, was called up. Now, the Red Crew doesn't get called up. I think in the history of Apollo and Shuttle, it's been a couple of times. And so I was riveted in the firing room, as we all were, as we watched Billy, who was the mature, seasoned lead for the Red Crew. He selected Trenton, who was a young technician, probably had no idea how much history he was making by going out there. And Chad, the safety guy, and then Bryce was sitting on console directing their efforts from the firing room. And what was so riveting about it, right, the vehicle's completely loaded, the area has been cleared for hours at this point, and they go out there and, you know, that rocket is talking. It's creaking, it's groaning, you have the winds, you have the cryos out there that's making things move around. And so we were riveted watching these guys all dressed in their, you know, hazmat suits going out there. Trenton was able to successfully torque the bolts and allow the launch to go forward. But again, riveting to the end as we watched them there from the firing room. And I had the opportunity to sit down with that crew afterwards, because I really wanted to hear from them. What was it like to be out there with the eyes of the world on you, and what did it feel like? And it was really special to hear from them. Trenton, who his mom actually works in NASA's KSC's engineering directorate, she was like flipping out that her son, you know, because again, there's a safety thing. But again, this is what the team trains for, right? These take on these contingencies and make it happen. And so again, I'm really incredibly proud. At the end of the last year, 2022, Orion, we got, you know, successfully splashed down the Pacific, like you said, got trucked back, arrived shortly before the end of the year, transported over to the processing facility. They started the deservicing operation, taking off the heat shield. The Orion program was really anxious to get that heat shield back and really start analyzing and seeing if anything needed to be done differently for Artemis II. So you asked a little bit about what's next. The teams are preparing for Artemis II, which of course is going to be another elevated level of excitement, in my opinion, because we're going to be putting humans on that vehicle. And that always sort of ratchets up the excitement for the next launch. So we're not having Artemis II in 2023, but we are targeting 2024 for that launch, and really across the agency, teams are preparing the hardware for that. Our EGS team, Exploration Ground Systems team, is putting in the crew safety systems, the emergency escape system. They're going to be working on that this year and improving the environmental control system that we really struggled through leading up to Artemis I. The European service module is already at KSC, so the Orion program's already taken that and integrating it. The ICPS, I like to call it the second stage, is in final assembly. The core stage, the big core stage, is being completed at Michoud, and it's going to be shipped to Kennedy this summer. So we're going to see it on the Pegasus barge arrive at the Kennedy Space Center this summer, and so then it's going to go in the VAB, and we're going to start the processing for Artemis II at that time. So again, super exciting. The boosters, all 10 segments for Artemis II and III, are already complete and ready to go. And I will mention one launch that we're going to have this year on the CLPS program, the Commercial Lunar Payload System Services, CLPS, Prime 1, and that is a polar, we procured it from a commercial company. It's a polar lunar lander. They're going to be commercial company delivering it commercially. They own the lander. They are responsible for delivering this payload to the surface of the moon. And the Prime really has two components. It's got a drill, and then it's got an instrument called the M-SOLO, the mass spec. And we at KSC developed the instrument M-SOLO. So again, very proud to sit up here and brag about my team back at the center. They took a commercial off-the-shelf mass spectrometer. They worked with the company to essentially make sure it could withstand the harsh environment of space, that it could operate on the surface, lunar surface, because when they drill stuff, they want to take the mass spec and figure out, you know, how much ice or other things that are out there and send that data back. So we can look forward to that particular launch in 2023.
It's exciting.
A lot of stuff going on, a lot of stuff in prep for Artemis 2 and 3.
Yeah, the first stage of those in situ resources that we're looking at when we have that long-term presence on the moon, and it's starting really at Kennedy. That's really neat to think about.
Yep.
So we've seen a lot of comparison, and I think you even alluded to that, talking about how Kennedy was established to support the Apollo program. And so we've seen a lot of comparison between, the program at the beginning of the space race to Artemis, the sister program. And the launch of Artemis 1, right at liftoff, if you're watching, we actually heard Daryl Nell say that line, "Together we rise." So what's that primary difference between the Apollo and the Artemis program is that we're rising together this time. Can you talk a little bit about what those partnerships are, who we're going with together, and what that means?
Sure. So I think Apollo was really a government-led program. NASA, being a federal agency, led that. Artemis is very different, starting with the Artemis Accords, but together partnerships with internationally as well as our industry partners, it's going to take all of us to go back to the lunar surface in a more sustainable way. So Artemis is designed to have partnerships both across the international community as well as the private industry. So, I'll just start with Orion. I already mentioned the European Service Module that's built by ESA, so they're going to be a continuing part of the program. Also on Artemis 1, there was a couple of payloads on the inside the Orion capsule, really collecting data. Again, as we put crew on, we want to make sure that the environment that the Orion is going to go through, that the crew is going to be able to survive it. And one of those experiments was MARE, Mastertech Astrorad Radiation Experience, and it really was two Moonikins. One had a vest on it. It was a radiation protection vest on it. And that was a collaboration between a German company and the Israeli Space Agency to develop that MARE experiment. And again, that's going to be incredibly important as we go further out to the moon and then further out into deep space to be able to protect our astronauts. So that's another example of an international partnership. We had some industry. I think you guys may have heard about Callista, which was a partnership with Amazon Alexa and Cisco's WebEx, and it provides a collaboration tool, an iPad, the experience and how we talk and communicate and collaborate and do work here on Earth. We want to replicate that in the capsule. So that was another experiment with some industry partners. Gateway is going to be the lunar orbiting outpost around the moon. And again, that's designed from the very beginning to be a partnership with internationals as well as industry. So the two essential elements of the lunar outpost, Gateway around the moon, is going to be the PPE, which is a commercial company, as well as Halo, which is a international partnership, and then they're going to have IHAB. ESA is going to be sending up a habitation module for that lunar outpost. And I don't know if you were on the panel or listened to any of the panels yesterday, but Mark Weiss is part of our deep space logistics program at Kennedy, and he talked a lot about Gateway and it being in comparison to the International Space Station today, that's like a 5-bedroom house compared to Gateway. When it starts off, it's going to be like a studio apartment. But that lunar outpost is going to be incredibly important going forward. It's a way station for missions down to the surface of the moon, and then a place to come back, get back on the Orion, and come home. So it's incredibly important, and across the international, different elements of that are going to be provided by our international partners. I already mentioned CLPS, the Commercial Lunar Payload Services. And that's an incredible program that was started by our science mission director. It's kind of the first time where we're asking the commercial industry to provide lunar lander surfaces, robotic lunar lander surfaces as a service. So they own the vehicle, they're responsible end-to-end delivery of those payloads to the surface of the moon, and then operate them on the surface of the moon. So again, an incredible different way of thinking about partnerships and how we're going to explore the moon. We're using partnerships across industry and our international partners.
So we're rising together and we're
We are
staying
rising
together.
together, and we're going to stay. We're going to be dependent on each other. Yep.
So along those lines, what are the benefits for not just the agency, because certainly we can see that when NASA's a customer, there's a benefit in being able to utilize funding in different ways and really be able to focus on the things that have a direct return to the program. But also for the economy and for the industry, what does that mean to create these commercial partnerships when we go back to the moon? We've seen a little bit of that with ISS and low Earth orbit, but on a bigger scale, on a lunar scale, and a sustainable scale, how does that benefit, kind of return to Earth, off planet for the planet along those lines? How do you see that kind of impacting industry?
So kind of the idea of Artemis, or I should say, low Earth orbit, NASA has an objective of turning that over to the commercial industry, right, through several of the partnerships we've had, getting our astronauts to and from the space station, through the Commercial Crew Program. So commercial companies have the capability to do stuff in low Earth orbit. By starting out being an anchor tenant, whether it's through the CLIPS program or further, with NASA as an anchor tenant, we're bringing the commercial companies up there so by themselves they can see if there's a business case, if there's they can do their own exploration, and it's not just a NASA single, company. Now, of course, NASA's going to be leading it, but by having the partnerships from the very beginning, I think we increase the capabilities when we get to the surface of the moon, and those capabilities can help us to stay there in a more sustainable way. So I think by bringing everybody along and by these unique contracts and partnerships that we have internationally and with our industry partners, we're going to be setting ourselves up to be more sustainable from the beginning. And again, eventually, we could be the anchor tenant and still use these companies and partnerships, but we're not doing it solely by ourselves. We're bringing everybody along.
We're building a bigger table.
Building a bigger table.
So with that commercialization, it's not just something that we're seeing in the Artemis program, and you touched a little bit about this when we talked, about ISS, but it's actually become part of the fiber of Kennedy as well, how the operations have changed from that transition from a government facility to now we're seeing that kind of explosion in commercialism in the Space Coast and really in the industry itself. So can you talk a little bit about how those partnerships have changed what we're doing at Kennedy, and then how do you know it's working? Which I think is the big question. And then how do you intend to make sure that that's something that's sustainable into the future as we continue to see, that space travel, space industry is really here to stay?
So I would say, evidence that it's working is just look at our Commercial Crew Program, right? We have 2 providers today that are going to be providing, one provider has successfully provided transportation for our astronauts to and from the space station, and later this year our second provider is going to be embarking on their first crewed flight test to ensure that their vehicle can make it up there. So again, that has spurred other, and I think Jared Isaacman is going to be talking next, spurred other industries for private citizens to go up in space. So I think the Commercial Crew Program is like probably the most solid evidence that it's working, that buying a service and allowing the commercial industry to innovate and develop their own vehicles and own those vehicles and then provide that service. I think that's the biggest evidence. You mentioned the evolution of the spaceport, and I think probably most everybody in this audience has heard the story of the transformation of the Kennedy Space Center. With the ending of the shuttle program, we made some choices about what we wanted to look like in the future. And so, we did, starting with land and assets and excess capacity that we didn't need, we were able to outgrant that to private industry. And so if you come to the center today, again, it really is a very revitalized spaceport, multi-user spaceport with a lot of companies operating out there. We have more than 90 partners, over 200 agreements, and counting, because as I said, facilities, assets, then we went to land. Could we outgrant our land? We have, we're large. We have 144,000 acres, but only about 7,500 of those are developable. We sit on a wildlife refuge. We are very much about protecting the environment. So we're getting to the point where we have to be a little bit more picky and choosy about the rest of the land that we have out, because again, we want to help increase the capacity and the capabilities that we have out at the center. The other thing I'll say that I've noticed is many of our commercial partners, as well as our NASA programs, are starting to consolidate their operations at the launch head. And before, people would, they're manufacturing their tests in their own factories, transport it to the launch head, stick it on a rocket, and launch it. But more and more, you'll see some of the providers are consolidating their operations at the center in either a campus-like environment or full manufacturing test operations, so they could be near to the launch pad. And what that does is it's way more efficient for them. And then on our side, what we have to do to ensure that that growth continues is make sure that our capabilities and our capacity are sized correctly to support that increased growth. And we work at the center at Kennedy, we work very, very closely with our Space Force partners, because for every single launch that goes off the entirety of either the Kennedy Space Center property, our spaceport, or the Cape's land and their spaceport, every single one of those launches are supported by both of us. There wasn't a launch that would happen unless both of our parties were involved. And so we work very, very closely with the Space Force. We're looking across the systems, everything from wastewater, the propellants, the communication system, the data, telemetry, weather, all of the systems to make sure that they're sized and have the capacity for launches. You probably heard this, but 2 years ago we were at 31 launches. Last year we were at 57, and this year we're upwards of 90. And General Purdy and I, talked about this years ago. I think we were one of the few people that actually thought we'd be at hundreds of launches in a much shorter period of time than people thought. They were, again, it's very historic to have that many launches on our manifest. And again, we're working to get legislative authorities. Space Force is working to get some legislative authorities that will allow us to support the number of operations and launches that are occurring on our property, because 90 plus launches, something like 79 of those are commercial. So it's not just all about the government anymore. It's more about supporting the commercial industry, and we want to enable the commercial industry to thrive. We want to see hundreds of launches off the Eastern Range, and we don't want to be the one that prevents a launch from going forward. So
it's incredible. I think I actually heard them brief that the number of launches that we've had just in the last year was more than the first 3 years of the space base combined, which is incredible to think about. It was groundbreaking then, but we've far surpassed that, so that's really exciting to think about. So we saw in the video, in the opening video, Artemis was a huge focus for Kennedy this year, but as we can see, there's actually so much more that goes on outside of the Exploration Ground Systems and the Artemis mission at Kennedy. What do you have to look forward to this year? What are some other things, some of those launches that are on the manifest, and then some other things that you're looking forward to in 2023?
Yeah, so we got, I like to say KSC's happen in place. That's where things come together, and we get to see smoke and fire regularly. So I'll talk about a couple of our other programs. Our launch services program, which really was the first commercial endeavor into, NASA's first endeavor into the commercial space ecosystem, if you will. That program has been incredibly successful. It was housed here back in 1998. They essentially look at the commercial launch market. They take one of our NASA science payloads, they match them up, and they provide the mission assurance to ensure that it gets placed in the correct orbit. And that And that program has been incredibly successful. I like to say and brag about them. I believe they are the launch vehicle experts in the world. They have a very small, mighty, powerful team that really understands the launch vehicle market, and they have evolved over the last 20 years to meet the needs of the variety of launch vehicles that we have out there today. This year, on their manifest, they have, I think, something like 5 ELENA, the CubeSat missions. They have the TROPICS missions, which are some Earth-facing science payloads with a relatively new launch vehicle. And then later in the year, they have Psyche, which, of course, was supposed to launch last year. It's going to be on a Falcon Heavy, so that's going to be an incredibly important mission for NASA, the agency as a whole. I talked about the Commercial Crew Program. So coming up this weekend, I think the launch date is now on the 27th. We have Crew 6, so the 6th operational mission of SpaceX, transporting astronauts to and from the space station. There's 2 American astronauts, 2 astronauts from UAE going up there. So again, Crew 5 will come down, Crew 6 will go up, and then later this year, in fall, Crew 7 will be the 7th operational mission. And the Starliner, Boeing's program, successfully did their orbital flight test uncrewed. Coming up in a couple months, they're going to be doing their crewed flight test. So again, a huge amount of excitement around that program and the success. Looking forward to the success of getting a second partner, being able to transport our astronauts to and from the space station. I talked about EGS and all the preparations that they are doing for Artemis II. I mean, it's very evident, people were talking to me the other day, like, I thought, we were going to be able to rest after Artemis I, and they're still working, 6-7 days a week, nights and weekends and so forth, because we want to be prepared for Artemis II. I've talked about the hardware that's going to be showing up at our center, and they're going to get right back into the ops environment very quickly with that program. There's a couple resupply missions in the CRS, and we have our Exploration, Research, and Technology Directorate that house the people that support the payload cargo processing for those missions. So we're still quite busy at Kennedy. I wanted to say, hey, 23 without an Artemis launch, we'd be able to maybe not necessarily kick back, but not be as intense as we were last year, as we were really focused on getting that first mission, Artemis I, off, which we did. So we're in a rebuild, revitalize, right? We are looking across our portfolio, looking across our center, seeing what kind of processes do we still need to challenge. I ask my leadership team all the time, we don't accept status quo. I want you guys to challenge authority, challenge everything, challenge our processes. How can we become more efficient at supporting not only our government programs, but also the commercial industry? Because in order to continue to be successful as we have, we can't just rest on our laurels. We can't just accept the way we do business. So I'm constantly talking to my leadership team within every one of the programs and the organizations that support the programs in the commercial industry. Think about how can we keep up with the speed of business, right? The commercial industry really sets a pace. They have made us better by challenging us to do things better, and we've helped them as well. So it's really a symbiotic relationship.
Janet, I just want to thank you so much for sharing about what's happening at the spaceport that's launching humanity's future. It's always a treat to hear about the things that are going on, and so we really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Appreciate, again, like I said, I just love bragging about my team. I mean, we had a very historic year last year. I'm never going to forget it. I'm never going to forget all the things that we had to do to be successful. It was really a pivotal year in my life as well. And so just, the workforce we have, the team we have at Kennedy, couldn't be more proud of them, and love sitting up here bragging about them. So thank you, Leah.
Thank you.
Please welcome Spacecom Executive Director Ryan Brown.
Good morning, everybody. Just want to thank Leah and Janet. That was a great presentation. Always happy to have Janet up on the stage here with us. Before I bring Christian and Jared up on the stage, I just want to remind everybody, Jared is taking questions through the app during his presentation. So if you haven't already, download the Commercial Space Week app in the iOS or Android store. Select the Fireside Chat with Jared Isaacman, hit the blue Q&A button, and you can ask your questions there, and then Christian will moderate as the session goes on. So it's my distinct pleasure at this time to introduce Christian Davenport of the Washington Post and Jared Isaacman, Mission Commander, Polaris Dawn, and Inspiration4.
Good morning. So I'm Chris Davenport. I'm the space reporter at the Washington Post, and it's my pleasure to be joined this morning by Jared Isaacman, who probably needs no introduction, but is the founder and CEO of Shift4 Payments, but for this context in this conference is better known as an astronaut, the commander of the Inspiration4 mission, and he's leading the Polaris program and this ongoing collaboration with SpaceX. So Jared, welcome, good morning, thanks for being with us.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So obviously we're all familiar with the Inspiration4 mission, but what was so fascinating to me is that you built on that, and you're building on that to go to the Polaris program, and I wonder if you can just give us an overview of that.
Sure. So I actually thought Inspiration4 would be my last mission. It really it went incredibly well. So every one of the objectives that we set out, both things we wanted to accomplish here, home for Earth, and also what we wanted to accomplish in orbit were achieved. It was a great mission. I mean, you showed it could be done. You know, the first non-government astronauts to go into orbit. We were there for several days. You know, got a lot of great science and research done. You had the youngest American to go into space, a childhood cancer survivor. She became our medical officer. You had the first black female pilot of a spacecraft. I mean, hopefully we lived up to a lot of our inspirational objectives. And we raised, you know, nearly $250 million for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. So it felt like we set the bar really high, and the door was open for a lot of exciting missions to follow, and I thought that's where it would end. It was actually a couple months after we came back from Inspiration4, went to Starbase, Texas, to see the Starship program, which is, if you haven't been there, it's like a religious experience, really. It's I don't know, it has a lot of. I mean, it's truly. I mean, it's like a Manhattan Project level of endeavor in terms of complexity and costs in order to do something that is really almost unimaginable, which is this rapidly reusable launch vehicle to bring humans back to the moon and eventually to Mars. In any case, like on that visit, had a chance to meet with SpaceX senior leadership, including Elon, and talked about an idea of a series of test and developmental missions, doing things that either haven't been done before or haven't been done really in 50 years, as building blocks to eventually bring Starship online, which hopefully again becomes like the 737 for human spaceflight. So that was very appealing to me with my background, the idea of a test and developmental program. Came up with a series of 3 missions, the first of which is Polaris Dawn, which should launch this summer. And then the third mission will be the first flight of Starship. So that's kind of how it came to be. And anyway.
Well, so let's talk about that first mission, Polaris Dawn, which now is set for sometime this summer. In that, you're going to do a spacewalk, right? So if Inspiration4, first all non-governmental astronauts to orbit, now you're repeating that, but adding on something else to it, which obviously creates another layer of difficulty and training. How'd you come up with the idea of doing a spacewalk, and what is the sort of bigger purpose of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's only about 600 or so very lucky people who've been to orbit, almost entirely of which came from world superpowers. And there's a lot of learning that needs to take place as space opens up beyond just the few and to the many. So spacewalk, EVA. I mean, if we're going to go to the moon, if we're going to make life multiplanetary, people are going to have to leave the safety and comfort of a habitat or vehicle and do things, whether it's walking on the surface of Mars or potentially fixing some sort of a vehicle. that knowledge lives really entirely within 3 organizations in the world. It needs to spread. So, from SpaceX's perspective, building suits that don't cost a lot of money, like the kind of current generation of suits do, something that can be mass produced for hundreds, thousands of people someday, whether again it's lunar surface or Mars, is very important. So we are going to be testing probably one of the first new generation EVA suits in about 40 years as part of our mission. There's a whole process and procedure through it, a new pre-breathe protocol, and we're going to learn a lot. And then we're going to build on it for ideally our second mission and those to follow. So EVA is really important. We have other important objectives as part of that 5-day mission that we should be able to build upon for subsequent missions.
And can you talk a little bit about the training? Have you worked with NASA on that? Because as you mentioned, that expertise is somewhat stovepipe at a few institutions. I mean, how do you go about learning to do a spacewalk and do it safely?
Yeah, so, first I can't say enough about like a really talented team of SpaceX engineers to start from concept to, now we have our training suits cut, which is the last version before final flight suits are delivered. So that's pretty amazing progress. So you got a lot of talented people at SpaceX, and no question drawing on a lot of expertise from NASA. So they were kind enough to let us spend a couple days in their 20-foot chamber at JSC to test out our pre-breathe atmosphere, which reduces proved out that our chances for type 1 and type 2 DCS are well below the acceptable limits for the mission. But I know there's a constant exchange of data and information going on throughout the suit's evolution. But also, again, big credit to the SpaceX team to actually build it and get it to a point where we're now just months away from flying it.
Yeah. And just in terms of the logistics, is there anything you can share? How many people will go out? Will you be tethered? How's that all? What's it going to look like?
So there's no airlock on Dragon, so we're venting the entire vehicle down to vacuum. So as far as I'm concerned, all 4 crew members are doing an EVA. And actually, I think from like a historical perspective, if you go back to Gemini and Apollo missions, I think the moment you vented down the vehicle and opened the hatch, everybody got EVA credit for it. So that's the position I'm taking. There will be 2 crew members that will ultimately exit the vehicle, and then the other 2 are in support roles. And then I think we expect the operation to be about 2 hours from kind of beginning of venting to full repressurization. We'll see how much time we actually have, outside the vehicle, but we have a whole test protocol to go through so we can learn as much as we can about the suits. Because I'll tell you, I mean, I certainly underestimated how difficult it can be to operate once you pressurize it. It looks great when you put it on, and then when it's 4.5 psi, it's a rigid structure, and so there's an awful lot to learn. And we can take that feedback back to SpaceX for subsequent evolutions of the suit.
Is there anything you can tell us about the suit? I mean, if you just think about it for a minute, the spacesuit is its own mini spacecraft,
Yep.
right? I mean, it's an enormously complex piece of equipment. The fact that it's being developed by a private company is pretty extraordinary, and that they seem to be doing it in a relatively quick amount of time. Are there any details about it you can share with us?
Well, I think you start with what's certainly a very cool functional IVA suit, which is what I wore and all the NASA astronauts have worn on Dragon missions, and say, okay, well, that was a last line of defense. How do we build from here into something that's now primarily designed to be exposed to to vacuum and just the realities of what's out there. So you're going to go through a whole degree of micrometeorite testing. You have to reinforce the suit for that. There's insulation elements to it. Your visor, which presumably in an IVA scenario, you're not going to be probably exposed to just many of the same. You're not going to be exposed to many things that you would be outside the vehicle. There's levels of redundancy you now want to build into the suit. Insulation. So there's even, we're going to have some pretty nice insights to, the health of the suit and the vehicle that we wouldn't normally have because you'd be right under the displays, for example. So there's an awful lot that's gone into it. It's, again, super impressive.
We focus a lot on the spacewalk because that is pretty extraordinary, but you had mentioned earlier on that there are other objectives to the flight. Do you want to just talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, so all of the objectives for the Polaris program, really have to help answer the question, does this get us to Mars? And so for sure, developing a new suit and, building in-house some of the knowledge, expertise for conducting spacewalks, EVAs is important, but there's a number of other elements too. So for example, we'll fly to a 1,400 kilometer apogee, really just under the inner portion of the Van Allen radiation belts, and we'll be there for just long enough to get the data that we need, and then we'll come back down. But if you think about it, we haven't flown through that. Humans haven't done it in 50 years. The last time we walked on the moon. There's a lot from a human physiology perspective to it. There's a lot in terms of vehicle design and architecture. Are we going to use a lot of mass for radiation shielding, or can we get away with more of like a triple redundancy type architecture? So a number of our science and research experiments directly support are designed to gather data from that altitude, along with basically seeing certain things about how the vehicle reacts to that kind of radiation environment, and then we'll come down. That's our first objective that will be done within about 9 orbits after launch. Second is the EVA. Third, we'll communicate over Starlink's satellite constellation. I think that makes sense. Just there's, space is opening up. There's more activity, not just with human beings, but other commercial assets. And like right now, TDRS satellites and ground stations can be in high demand. For example, on my Inspiration 4 mission, we had 80% comm coverage throughout the mission, which would be somewhat unusual for human spaceflight. If it was a NASA mission, it would be the highest priority, so it would have access to TDRS and ground stations greater than anything else up there. That wasn't actually the case for us, and it shouldn't be as space opens up more and more. So what we need is just more communication infrastructure. Starlink can do that, not just for the moon, for Mars, and low Earth orbit. And then we have 5 days of science and research across about 30 different education institutions.
Will you be relying on Starlink exclusively for comms, or will you also, it's just sort of a test to do that?
Yeah, the ground stations and TDRS will still be prime, and then we'll see how much we'll get out of Starlink. Again, really, a lot of really talented people working on that problem. Laser-based communication, 2 objects at 17,500 miles an hour. I know, like, most people are going to think we just turned the router on, but it's actually it's quite a challenge. So a lot of smart people working on that problem.
Yeah. So what's crazy about this? We could talk all day just about the Polaris Dawn mission, but you've really put together, a private human spaceflight mission, a portfolio. The second one then potentially would go to boost Hubble. Can you talk about again how that came about? Where that stands now in terms of your ability working with NASA to be able to do that, and what the timing on that might be.
Yeah, I don't think there's too much I can share that other than what's already public, which is NASA, SpaceX, and Polaris began a study, I want to say back in September, to assess the feasibility of a rendezvous boost and augmentation of Hubble to leave it in a better, healthier state. So I'd say that there's been just tons of progress on it. There's a lot of enthusiasm, and from my perspective, it certainly builds off of Polaris Dawn. There are a lot of things that we are going to do on that mission, and if we get good, if they're successful, I certainly could see us building upon it for a mission like what's being potentially considered on Hubble.
Right. Okay. So the third one, and the one that a lot of people are really excited for, is Starship, the first crewed mission of Starship. Do you have any insight into how, since you're going to be flying on it, how the development of that vehicle is going? It looks like we could potentially have a launch as early as next month. Is that what you're anticipating?
So I probably know just as much as you from what's put out there on. I would say, like, I think there's 2 very focused efforts. One of which is get Super Heavy and Starship to orbit, which is the test you're referring to, and the other is HLS. And there is, so I think that, there's probably a lot of great learning, a lot of data being shared from NASA and SpaceX as to meet HLS requirements. I'm sure that's going to carry its way through many of the potential Starship models that are to be built. But it's exciting. I think that a lot of progress can happen very quickly. Like, so we're sitting here saying, well, they haven't done the first orbital flight of it yet, but they will. We're pretty close to that. And they have a lot of Starlinks to put in orbit, and I think the amount of learning that's going to take place is going to happen at a pretty accelerated pace. I mean, just think about it now. It has not been 3 years since human spaceflight has been restored to the U.S. With Demo 2 with Bob and Doug. It's not even been 3 years, and you got Crew 6 getting ready to go launch, plus 2 other commercial human spaceflight missions that have already been flown. That's an awful lot of progress in less than 3 years. So I'd say, like, once Starship gets to orbit, I think the pace of progress is going to be eye-watering. And when it is, I mean, who knows what's possible? That's a real game changer for spaceflight.
So how many launches of Starship do you imagine there will be before they put crew on it?
I don't know. I think that they have a constellation to build out with their next generation of Starlinks, and I think they're going to have a lot of just typical payload cargo customers that they're going to get experience from, and when they're ready, they'll be ready.
They'll do that. I may get this wrong, but I think Gwen Shotwell said hundreds recently. Does that sound like a reasonable number?
So I believe there's 2 Starship factories. One in Starbase, Texas, and I believe another one's being built in KSC. And I can just say it was about maybe six months or so ago. I was in Starbase and was on a tour, and I've been really lucky to see the progress there for a while now. And I had to kind of pause the group for a second and just we were in the nose cone manufacturing hangar, if you will, and I was like, I hope everyone just pauses and looks around and realizes that there are 6 nose cones around you. And what that means, they're not building one, they're building factories to build hundreds. That's interesting because, I think for everyone in this room has got to be really excited about what the future holds, but we don't really know for sure, what the space economy is beyond, what it's traditionally been used for. Government astronauts going up for science and research and national, missions. We have, reconnaissance and communication, but we don't really know the reason why we need hundreds or thousands of people in low Earth orbit someday. But I'll tell you, when the cost to accelerate mass to orbit diminishes to such an extent that Starship is capable of doing, not to mention all the other launch providers that are working on, fully reusable type vehicles, it's who knows what's in the realm of possible at that point. You can really experiment. So it's kind of exciting to see, that potentially come to fruition.
So we have a question from the audience, and thank you for sending these in, about people wanting to get involved in Polaris and even be potentially a crew member. Have you given any thought to the crew for the Hubble flight or the Starship flight, or is that something that you're thinking about in the future?
Well, I think you assemble a crew for the mission objectives, and with Inspiration 4, that was the first, and that came with a lot of responsibility, and our objective was really show it could be done and inspire people as to what's possible, in space, and also what we can accomplish here on Earth. And we assembled a really great crew for that. And I think in the case of Polaris Dawn and really the whole Polaris program, it's a different game plan. It's now that you showed it was possible, it's what can you get done. These missions have different risk profile than Inspiration 4 did. So you put a great crew together for them. And we have an unbelievable crew for Polaris Dawn. We have 2 incredible SpaceX engineers. One, the lead astronaut trainer, she trained, Sarah Gillis, she trained every NASA crew that's flown on a Dragon into space. She trained my crew on Inspiration 4. If you believe there's going to be hundreds or thousands of people going to space via, SpaceX at some point in the future, probably makes sense for her to have this experience. Our other mission specialist from SpaceX, Anna Menon, lead mission director, at SpaceX. Prior to that, biomedical engineer at NASA. She was a controller there for the International Space Station. She wrote the contingency procedures for venting a capsule down to vacuum, more for as an emergency response, and now it'll be actually a nominal activity for the mission. So it makes a lot of sense to have her on board there as well. So I think we'll look at whatever becomes Polaris 2 and try and put together a great crew for that mission, and then same for Starship. But the idea is like once this is complete and you have and Starship is operational and you don't just have one, again, you could have potentially hundreds of them. Everything changes. You're not going to need to go to space through Polaris, because ideally you're getting a lot closer to that Southwest Airlines, now boarding XYZ flight to low Earth orbit.
It's so fascinating to me that Sarah and Anna got picked for this crew after you had worked so closely with them during Inspiration 4. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that. I mean, to think you have a commercial company with an astronaut trainer training non-governmental employees. I mean, that's really amazing. And to have someone like Anna who was in your ear, I mean, that's who you were talking to. I mean, what was that like? I mean, just talk a little bit more about that experience.
Yeah, I mean, the Polaris program, it's a joint program with SpaceX. So, they certainly have a voice in who goes on these missions too. And, but I did put in, some recommendations coming off of Inspiration 4, where I thought there was a lot of trust that was built up and where people's background and skill set were really suited for what we wanted to accomplish with this mission. And Sarah and Anna are just absolutely great examples of that. So, yeah, that's how they were picked.
So there's another question here that I'm going to tweak slightly that talks about, you go to space and how does that benefit Earth? And there's a lot of people who look at this from the outside and, it's still very expensive, only for rich people. We have problems here at home. How do you address that?
Yeah, it's super valid, very fair, right? This has been the criticism since the beginning, that how can we spend so much money doing these things in space? There's no clear and obvious return, yet we have all of these hardships here on Earth, and it's totally a fair point. I mean, the answer is you have to do both. I mean, really throughout any point in time in history, that there's been dark periods. It's been dark periods throughout the entire stretch of it. You have a responsibility to try and address those problems, but you also have to invest in the future. You have to be willing to make progress. And the answer is you can do both. And we tried to show that with Inspiration 4. We partnered with a charitable organization that has nothing to do with human spaceflight at all. It's just, kids shouldn't die of cancer. They have an incredible vision that no child should die in the dawn of life. If you really want to set, humanity's, sights on things like making life multiplanetary, having a colony, on Mars someday, then, hopefully our resources should enable us and our capabilities to tackle things like childhood cancer along the way. And I think we showed with that mission that you can do both, and we're continuing to show that with the Polaris program. Look, you can make other arguments too, that throughout human spaceflight, the investments made have had a return here on Earth. There's capabilities that have been developed that make life better here. I think like Starlink constellation is a great example of it, not to mention some of the other investments that commercial industry is making, but you're able to connect disconnected communities all over the world. I think that the conflict in Ukraine is a great example of it. We have greater insight of what's going on. Like, tragedies, like really horrific events in human history that have been obscured because of lack of communication are a lot harder to happen again now. Not to mention weather or other satellites out there that, that make life better here on Earth. But the answer is it's both. And you got to be, everybody has to be super aware of it within industry. I'll tell you, like the idea of making life multiplanetary does not land with everyone. You really have to show that you can do both if you want to have the public support and really earn the right to make progress for tomorrow.
This moment that where we are in, sort of the growth of the commercial space sector, it's a really interesting point where you see this enormous growth, enormous capabilities that we hadn't seen as you pointed out, in a very short amount of time. But you also wonder too, is it outpacing regulation? You mentioned Ukraine, and yet, if you have a commercial entity, not just Starlink, but an imaging company, now all of a sudden they're in the middle of a foreign conflict. And you sort of wonder what roles and responsibilities do they have? What if they come under attack? I just sort of wonder, is the regulation keeping up with the technological advancements, do you think?
You know, I think a lot of the regulators are pretty wise right now to give adequate latitude for an industry to be born. Look, it's like I said, there really isn't an obvious space economy that beyond what it's historically been, and I think there will be, especially as again the cost comes down to accelerate mass to orbit. So until then, the last thing industry probably needs is to be overly constrained. Give it some opportunity to figure things out. And but what I will say is, like, for sure, there are going to be setbacks, and that's going to be the opportunity when the people come in that's said "I told you so," and certain things will get tightened up, and then we'll learn from them, and then push back a little bit, and like it'll be like an ongoing massaging process, I think, for sure. But I think it is important right now, while this next Space 2.0 age is in its infancy, to give it the latitude it needs to figure things out.
And so what is needed then for Space 2.5 or 3.0? Is it Starship? I mean, is that, and if so, just talk about what you think Starship will portend and bring to the industry.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be up here like giving the never-ending commercial on SpaceX, because I'm thrilled, honestly, to see all the investments that have made across the commercial space industry. I started a defense aerospace company in 2011, where everybody you worked with were kind of the usual names. It was Lockheed, Boeing, and Northrop. And well, it's certainly nice to see a lot of other names beyond that in aerospace industry. I think competition's an important ingredient for kind of our way of life here in the U.S. So SpaceX extraordinary, Rocket Labs is awesome. I mean, Blue Origin is going to be a player in this. Excited to see Relativity and their 3D printing capabilities. So look, everybody's doing some pretty awesome things out there, but no question, like a fully reusable launch vehicle, first and second stage, rapidly reusable, that much tonnage to low Earth orbit is a game changer. Absolutely, there's just no question. And we just don't know what it is, right? I've used the example quite a bit, but you think back to the 1980s and the cell phones, and it's rich people with their car phones, and like who could have possibly imagined back then that you fast forward the clock a couple decades, and some of the most valuable companies in the world have nothing to do with the cell phone or the towers, the infrastructure. They make software apps on the phones, and some of them I'm not really sure actually improve our way of life too much, but they're pretty valuable organizations, right? And I think the idea is that when you can bring down the cost to such an extent that you can just experiment, we really don't know what that future holds, what that industry looks like. And Starship is certainly closer than others, and it is going to be fully reusable and rapidly reusable, and they're going to make an awful lot of them. And yeah, I think that's going to be the game changer. Maybe I'm incorrect in using the 737 example, but could certainly be the DC-3 for human spaceflight.
Interesting. But so much of the commercial industry, it feels like, and not to keep it all on SpaceX, but it does seem like they're so far ahead. I mean, do you think that they will continue to blaze a trail and that you'll see others follow in their wake? Or is it just so difficult to do what they've done?
I think SpaceX has already, with reusable launch vehicles, opened up this frontier in a new way, but they can't solve every problem. I mean, there's plenty when you start thinking about Mars, and I think Elon and the SpaceX team are quite open. Like, we have our focus on a few areas, and I think it's pretty obvious when you see that, those few areas, it's like, well, I can get a lot of people there. I don't necessarily know that I can keep the civilization alive there the whole time and prevent like a big Lord of the Flies event. I think there's a lot of problems that need to be solved, and SpaceX can't solve them all, and that's perfect. That's going to create opportunity for many organizations that are out there. So, being able to land a booster on a ship, bring it back to land, turn it around in a couple weeks, launch it again was a game-changing moment. That's not the end of it. It's not game over here for everybody else in industry. There's going to be so many opportunities as this frontier continues to be open.
So, right. We're maybe on the precipice, or certainly have made a lot of progress in that regard in the last 5-10 years. But the sort of self-sustaining space economy, I don't think we're there. The government is still a big driver in this, and is capital investment, which maybe it's somewhat relatively new that there, people looked at space as a very risky investment. It was for enthusiasts, and we saw a lot of money come in. A lot of companies go public through SPACs. Some did fine, some are struggling. And given where the economy is today and going forward, what do you think that looks like going forward in terms of the investment community?
I mean, we got a little bit of a pendulum swing going on right now. I mean, you're talking about nearly 15 years of a zero interest rate environment where capital allocators were encouraged to take risk, and you saw that across a number of industries, not just aerospace in 2021. And so look, there's good and bad. The bad side is like, the pendulum swing now to, a far less accommodating economic climate. And I mean, rightfully so. I mean, if you can get like, 2-year guaranteed money at like 4.5%, you're not going to probably take too many moonshots. And as a result, like some businesses that maybe were ahead of their time at that point, like it'll be a struggle. But I think their investments they've made will not be lost. Like these are capabilities that will evolve into maybe a new entity at some point in time, and eventually will probably, or hopefully will deliver on their purpose. So that's kind of the good element out of it, right? But yeah, we are definitely talking about a pretty big whipsaw event between 2021 and what what 2022 was like. And 2023, I don't think is going to be really that much different. So fantastic that a lot of new names got a lot of capital to change the way we've done things historically. I hope to see that across all of aerospace. It's so desperately needed, and the defense sector in general. Like it's kind of tired of the same names that have been out there doing things for the same way for a long time. But yeah, I mean, it might have been, it certainly will be challenging for some, just given the timing. It is still an immature 2.0 phase of commercial space, and yeah, it's just a less accommodating economic climate right now.
So, I mean, what do you think some of those other areas for growth are going forward? And the Space Press Corps, and I'm guilty of this, we focus a lot on two things. We focus on the rockets, and we focus on, and there are a lot of great rockets right now that fills up a lot of print, and astronauts. I mean, from Victor Glover and Christina Koch to Jared Isaacman. And yet I feel like we don't spend as much time looking into the technologies that are needed for the long-term sustainability, whether it's in low Earth orbit, on the moon, or on Mars. I mean, what are to you some of the more interesting areas?
Yeah, I mean, look, that is the question, right? Like, why do we, again, need hundreds or thousands of people in low Earth orbit or on the lunar surface? And while it's expensive, it's going to be hard to know. What I think is interesting now is you see more national space programs that are sending people to space than historically did. So that says something, like cost is coming down. Certainly there's commercial space missions where non-government astronauts are going into low Earth orbit. So that's telling you that costs are coming down in a correct direction, and that's the launch provider area, so you're rightfully so should be focused on that, because that is the big challenge of getting mass into orbit. So let's see what happens when that continues to come down. Let's see what happens when human beings return to the lunar surface, and who knows what we're going to find there. That could be that next, that creates that, like, I don't know, economic revolution that requires an enduring presence either on the lunar surface or in low Earth orbit. Maybe it's helium-3, who knows? It's kind of exciting, but I know that we need to get there in order to figure it out, and we need to make it affordable enough that it's worth rolling the dice and taking the risk on some of these things to figure out if it is a true game changer. And by the way, if others are doing it, we have to do it too. That's beyond just at a commercial level, it's at a national level. You can't risk missing out on what that next transformational event could be for humankind. So yeah, anyway, I think being rightfully focused on the launch provider is if there's enough competition there and an evolution of capabilities to bring down costs to such an extent that we can experiment, that's certainly going to be your path to whatever the next whatever that space economy is that actually requires us to be there for a while.
Yeah. So there's a question here on the iPad on orbital debris, and I just wonder how that factored into the Inspiration4 mission, how it does with this one. It was sort of fascinating to me, just with the Artemis 1 flight, all the different cutouts they had. We saw SpaceX had a little tension with the FAA over their orbital or the trajectory filing. But you're going to be getting out of the out of the spacecraft, which I know is, has got some redundancy in case it were to be hit. But we just saw the Soyuz and the Russian Progress maybe suffer some damage because of a micrometeorite, or I don't know that we know entirely. But what do you think about that? I mean, how much does that go into your factoring?
This is so important. Generally, I think when there's like a conflict and lives are being lost, that people will break any sort of rule in order to get ahead, but that's not the case. Like, we've actually seen throughout world wars and major conflicts, even with some pretty lunatic dictators out there, there is a line that doesn't get crossed. You don't bomb nuclear reactors. Like, there are certain things that if you do this, like, you are destroying like parts of the world for thousands of years or whatnot, right? That same mindset has to be applied to like kinetic warfare in low Earth orbit. It has to. There is not going to be any good way to clean this mess up if it happens. Like, you will deny low Earth orbit for commercial and human spaceflight for who the hell knows how long. Yes, you can build redundancy to MMOD. You can't really effectively shield too well from it. I mean, you got to basically track anything like really of a 1/4 inch size or greater and stay the hell away from it. You stay at the ISS altitudes 400 kilometers, you're in decent enough shape that the atmosphere should be able to clean it up soon enough. You go above that and it's very dangerous. Give you a sense, on Inspiration 4, we had the same probability of a catastrophic MMOD strike in 3 days that a NASA crew would have over 6 months on the space station, and that was just by going 200 kilometers higher. You get up like anywhere up towards 1,000 kilometers, those numbers get way worse. And in fact, we actually took several like very small, like millimeter size or less actual hits on Inspiration 4 as a result. I went to, as part of our spacesuit development, we went to White Sands Missile Range to see NASA's facility where they, accelerate objects to near orbital velocity speeds, and they just fire it at things. And they, I'll tell you, like, they show you, a quarter inch, metallic object accelerated to 8 kilometers a second, went through 3 feet of aluminum. Like, you're not going to put that much shielding on a vehicle. Like, the answer is don't get hit. Like, that's what the testing shows. Like, it's like, will a 1 millimeter object, at 8 kilometers a second go through a spacesuit? Sure will. And the only difference at that point is, like, is the suit designed enough to give you the time necessary to, execute on a contingency and get back in the vehicle? And yes, and that's how you design a good suit. But you're not designing the suit to withstand that hit. Spacecraft have redundancy built in because if it does take a hit, you have another system hopefully to rely upon on there. But like, the answer to this whole thing is you can't start shooting satellites in low Earth orbit. That has to be looked at essentially, in my opinion, at like the same level as literally blowing up someone's nuclear reactor in their backyard. Like, you are going to create a crisis for all of humankind. So yeah, it's an incredibly important topic. I hope there's a good understanding of it.
So I take it, though, that the hits that Dragon had while you were up there were nothing severe, because
No.
they're using this Dragon, I think, for Crew 6 coming up, right?
No, so the Dragon I flew on Inspiration 4 is also the Dragon that's slated for Polaris Dawn. And look, I mean, the International Space Station has has taken plenty of very small hits, and they've built the space station to manage that. So like there is a certain amount expected, and there's a lot of tracking that Space Force does, unfortunately so, and they'll need to continue to. I'm very happy we have a Space Force, by the way. Is like the high ground is going to keep getting higher and higher, especially as space gets opened up, and you need people looking out for us and everyone out there about whether dangers of those objects like MMOD and other things. But yeah, spaceship's fine.
Okay, good. It's interesting when you talk about the Space Force and national security space, and I just got to thinking and hearing from the Space Force, hearing from people like General Purdy and General Thompson, is that, at least publicly, they're saying they really do want to work with the commercial sector, that they want to harness those capabilities. And you could see, a Starlink version for the Pentagon and using Starship. So maybe in a way you're already sort of helping develop the technology that could have national security implications. But is that something you thought of? Is there a possibility that there could be like a Polaris-like program, not necessarily yours, but a civilian program that there's some sort of partnership with the national security community?
Well, I don't, it's not part of any of our like direct objectives for the Polaris program, but for sure, I think SpaceX is building capabilities that are useful for the defense industry. I mean, they launch national security missions, and I wouldn't be surprised as, again, space opens up, becomes more accessible, costs come down, that the Space Force will probably, I would hope actually, I think it's kind of inspiring in a way that they have a presence in, a human presence in low Earth orbit and eventually maybe on the moon. I mean, like I said, that high ground's been important throughout, I think, military history, and it's only getting higher right now. And I don't think we can afford as a nation for our own national security to ignore that. So I'm very happy there's a dedicated force thinking about that. Because again, you don't know what the future holds. Maybe there is an economic game changer that's unlocked on the lunar surface, where you've got to protect those interests. You got to protect the people that are going there, and whatever that. Whatever it is there that's fueling that economy. But I do think, like, again, you do see the advantages of things like Starlink and how it's, it is saving lives in Ukraine. And I think that, again, as the costs come down, put more objects in orbit, you can take some risks, experiments. There's going to be capabilities that'll have the benefit for humans all over the world.
Yeah. Earlier on, you were talking about, benefiting Earth and those problems. I also wonder too, because there's a lot going on internationally with Russia and particularly China. And on the one hand, we can all be sort of enthusiastic about space. I mean, certainly the people in this room, in a conference like this, we're preaching to the choir. But I wonder how much that resonates with the general public, and also, if it's really going to be something that China does. How do you think about that? Do you see what China is doing or other countries as what's really going to sort of motivate the United States or United States government to move with an even greater sense of urgency?
Well, like I said, I'm a big fan of competition. So I think, it fuels a lot of innovation. It brings down costs. It helps change things, whether like it's a plane you're building, a spaceship, or, a drive outward into space. There's a competition with China. If there's general public awareness is not to the same extent as the space race in the 60s, then we should probably do something about that. They put up almost as many orbital rockets last year as the United States, and we have rockets that land on ships that you can fly again in 2 weeks, and they don't. I think that speaks to their commitment. I think also just a general awareness. It is the high ground. There is a lot up there from their own national security perspective. I think there's also a lot that they want to seek out and unlock in space too. I mean, they've landed probes on the far side of the moon. Like, we don't know. We know there's certainly more helium-3 there. I don't know if that'll necessarily be, the future mines for fusion energy here on Earth. But who knows? Like, we don't know until we're there. But I know they've gotten there. And I generally believe that if you didn't have, programs like HLS well in the works right now, that China could certainly return to the moon before we could. I'm sure that's part of their ambition. So this is good. Like, this doesn't always have to be like viewed at in a negative light. If it helps fuel industry across this room to get funding, that's important to, evolve the industry. If it motivates, the people all over the world, American people, that like this is important. Again, we should be making progress in space. We can do amazing things here, but we're not going to take our sights off this because we should be there. This is who we are.
Well, it's so interesting. I mean, it must have been 5-7 years ago. I was at a conference and heard Bill LaPlante, now back at the Pentagon, say, people in 1957, people freaked out over Sputnik. Like, it was absolute paranoia. And he said, you know, if the American public had an understanding of what was going on in space today, even the unclassified stuff, we should maybe have that level. And then you see the Chinese spy balloon, and it's like, all right, I feel like we got a touch of that, maybe. But you know, what do you think it takes for that to really resonate with the public? As someone who's out there publicly talking about space, doing the Netflix documentary, open to the media, doing conferences like this, I mean, there's a public education portion that goes into this.
I think that it would be, if people woke up one day and saw that, you know, you had, you know, Chinese technauts on the moon waving, you'd have congressional hearings. You'd have whoever's in the office, regardless of which side you're on the political spectrum, not winning again. I mean, I think that there would be like outrage. I mean, for as much people were talking about balloons flying over, like, what happened? How could we do this? We've spent how many billions of dollars? You know, we developed the capability to do this in the first place, and we couldn't get back before somebody else did. Like, I think it would be a national wake-up call of like epic levels if that happens.
Do you think we're on a track to avoid that, or do you think we're on a track where that's possible?
I think that it's remains to be seen. Like, right? I think like there are a lot of things that we could be doing better. Like that. I don't know. I give you a great example. Like, you know, the backbone of our Air Force today came from a competition 50 years ago where 7 different companies submitted bids, and those planes are still in production 50 years later because now there's only 2 that make airplanes. Like I think there's a lot that we need to do differently if we want to remain competitive. And I think this really just speaks to like the heart. Like, I think at its core, it's the competitiveness of our nation. And there's a lot we should be doing differently, and maybe it actually takes a wake-up call for us to, and a bunch of congressional hearings to rethink things. But if we set our sights on it, I'm quite sure we should win.
All right, so last question, because we're out of time. And at these space conferences, people ask, you know, 20 years out, where do you think we are? But I like to put it at a, you know, 10-year time frame, because I think there's more of a reasonable forecasting. So what do you think, 10 years?
You know, 2 years ago during, you know, training for Inspiration 4, somebody asked me when we were going to get to Mars, and I was like, assuming that we still have a low cost of capital and accommodating environment, I think you could get there really in like 10 to 12 years. And we don't have that low cost of capital environment anymore. But I'd like to think that, you know, things play themselves out right. I mean, the next 10, 12 years, you certainly have human beings that are back on the moon, and a really good chance that you have people walking on another planet for the first time.
Fantastic. Jared Isaacman, thank you so much. Real pleasure.
Thanks, guys. We are running a few minutes behind, so the breakout sessions are going to start at 10 a.m. We're going to let them run a few minutes longer than they would have normally so they can get their entire talks in. So I'm going to keep you for just a few more minutes. I'll get you out here as quick as possible. I need to say thank you to a few people before we close out the week here. The first thank you goes out to our sponsors and exhibitors here at Commercial Space Week and SpaceCom Space Congress. If it were not for them, we could not produce this event in the way that we do. And so if you're in the exhibit hall today, or you see the list of the sponsors out there in the lobby, and you see them, see it on their badges, shake their hands, say thank you, because it's not possible without them. Very, very special thank you to our program planning committee. They didn't know I was going to thank them, I don't think, here this morning, but I'm going to call them out because they deserve it. NASA Kennedy Space Senator Susie Cunningham, she was sitting over here, but she's disappeared, is a critical component to helping us put this event on and connecting us to the government speakers that are here. Axient's Tina Leedy is our rock star and pulls all this together for you. So if you've spoken at our conference or you're a member of the National Space Club Florida chapter, you know who Tina is. She's amazing, and thank you, Tina. Thank you to the event staff. If you see, I'm not wearing it right now, but the white SpaceCom badges, they're usually running around like chickens with their heads cut off, but we promise all is fine. Say thank you to them, because again, if it were not for them, we'd not be able to do this the way that we do. So over the course of the week, we've heard from some of the most forward-thinking and innovative leaders in the commercial space industry. We've gained insight from them on the latest developments, trends, and opportunities in the business. Stage is creaking. I'm going to stop moving. But it's not just that content that makes this conference so valuable. It's the connections and collaborations that we've formed, it's the ideas that we've sparked, and the inspiration that we've gained from each other. And you know, General Purdy ended the Space Mobility Conference on Tuesday with this idea, and Janet ended her talk this morning with the same concept. Let's take those ideas, connections, inspiration, and let's turn that into action. Let's break down barriers, let's push the boundaries of what's possible, and together let's shape the future of commercial space. Thank you for being a part of this incredible community. Thank you for letting us be a part of this community. And we will see you next year at SpaceCom Space Congress 2024. Thank you. Have a great day today. We'll see you next year.